From February 17 to March 15, 1979, a border war broke out on the border between China and Vietnam, known in Chinese history as the Self-Defense War against the Vietnam border. This small-scale and short-term border war finally led to the two socialist brotherly countries, China and Vietnam, turning against each other, and also left a foreshadowing for the United States to return to Asia and contain China. It also led to the United States not only from the disastrous Vietnam War. Vietnam's history is called the Vietnam Anti-US War, slowed down and stood firm, and also stopped the high-spirited Vietnam and the Soviet Union from expanding in Southeast Asia by taking advantage of the victory. The domino effect skillfully preserved the U.S. sphere of influence in Southeast Asia. For this war, the United States is now serving as the starting point for the United States to return to Asia and contain China, and as a tonic for the United States to intervene in the South China Sea. Both China and Vietnam, however, are now silent on the war. Not only China is now downplaying this war, Vietnam is also downplaying this war, and every museum in Vietnam does not mention this war. Vietnam museums only have historical pictures and cultural relics of Vietnam's anti-US war. After 40 years of ups and downs, both China and Vietnam have seen clearly the mastermind role and true purpose of the United States in the Sino-Vietnamese border war. The two red communist countries are also facing subversion and threats from the United States. Both countries are deeply wary of the United States. They both know that the United States wants to kill people with a knife, and it wants both China and Vietnam to suffer. The United States invaded Vietnam and committed serious war crimes. On October 26, 1955, under the planning of the United States, with the support of France, the United Kingdom, and the Chiang Kai-shek regime that retreated to Taiwan, Ngo Dinh Diem established the government of the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam, and assumed the post of president. The US and the West relied on the Ngo Dinh Diem regime to contain the communist Ho Chi Minh government, and the strip-shaped Vietnam formed a strategic pattern of military confrontation between South Vietnam supported by the US and the West and North Vietnam supported by the Soviet Union and China. Since then, the United States has also been deeply involved in the quagmire of the Vietnam War. On July 30, 1964, the United States created the Tokyo Bay Incident in Vietnam, not only taking the opportunity to sink a torpedo boat in northern Vietnam. Moreover, it also used this as an excuse to carry out retaliatory bombing against northern Vietnam. Sunk or severely damaged 25 torpedo boats in northern Vietnam, and bombed and attacked naval and land military installations in northern Vietnam. The hot war curtain of the American Army's invasion of Vietnam has officially begun. The northern Vietnamese government requested military assistance from the Soviet Union and China, and countries such as the Soviet Union, China, and North Korea began to openly provide military assistance to Vietnam. At the end of 1964, the Soviet Union sent Air Force units and anti-aircraft missile units to North Vietnam. In early 1965, the Chinese government sent special plane transportation troops, Air Force radar troops, Air Force anti-aircraft artillery troops, railway troops, engineering troops, medical and chemical defense troops to Vietnam. China vigorously trained Vietnamese Air Force pilots. North Korea sent 2 women's anti-aircraft artillery battalions to Vietnam to defend the capital, Hanoi. Soviet pilots, the Soviet Surface-to-Air Missile Force, and the Chinese anti-aircraft artillery force worked hand-in-hand to shoot down thousands of American planes in Vietnam, including more than 100 B-52 strategic bombers, including Robert Worley, commander of the 3rd Division of the U.S. Air Force. The B-52 strategic bomber that the Major General took. The United States got deeper and deeper in the Vietnam War, launching large-scale carpet bombing in the air, causing hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties. The U.S. military also used a large number of incendiary bombs and gas bombs against the Vietnamese anti-U.S. troops. Among them, the famous U.S. military used chemical weapons such as orange poison on a large scale, causing casualties and disabilities of more than 3 million ordinary Vietnamese people. In the 10 years from 1961 to 1971, the U.S. military released more than 86 million liters of orange poison, containing high concentrations of dioxins, only in a jungle in southern Vietnam where guerrillas were more active, causing humanitarian problems. Disaster and severe aftermath of chemical weapons. The author himself witnessed a large number of historical photos and evidence of the use of incendiary bombs and chemical weapons by the U.S. military in the National Museum in Hanoi, the capital of Vietnam, in 2015. The atrocities committed by the US military in Vietnam led to condemnation from all over the world, and the anti-war voices in the United States also continued to rise. The US economy was already unsustainable due to the drag of the Vietnam War. The US dollar continued to weaken and the gold inventory was exhausted. As a result, the US president had to announce in 1971 the decoupling of the US dollar from gold. The Bretton Woods system that supported the US dollar and US economic hegemony officially disintegrated, and the US empire state building began to crumble. The Americans did not have the capital to continue the war in Vietnam, which was thousands of miles away from the mainland. The President of the United States had to announce the withdrawal of all US troops from Vietnam from February 1973. In April 1975, the Communist Army in northern Vietnam approached the city, and the defense line of the southern Vietnamese army completely collapsed. On the evening of April 21, President Nguyen Van Thieu, supported by the United States, announced his resignation, and President Phu Chen Van Huang took over as president. After less than 5 days, Chen Wangxiang also announced his resignation. On the morning of April 30, 1975, shortly after the last U.S. helicopter took off from the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, South Vietnam, tanks of the North Vietnamese Army broke through the iron gate of the U.S. Embassy and occupied the embassy. American Ambassador Martin and American officials were almost captured. A few hours later, the South Vietnamese presidential palace was captured, and Yang Wenming announced his surrender. The Vietnam War ended with the complete defeat of the United States and South Vietnam. On January 2, 1976, North and South Vietnam were unified. After the reunification of Vietnam, the name of the country is Socialist Republic of Vietnam. With the disintegration of the Soviet Union, Vietnam is now the only country in the world that uses socialism as its country name. 2. The United States has set traps for both Vietnam and China. The United States is not reconciled to ceding Southeast Asia to the Red Communist Party. The United States has just been defeated and is powerless to fight. The Americans thought of splitting and disintegrating the Communist Party camp, provoking internal struggles in the Communist Party camp, in an attempt to prevent or delay Vietnam's march into the entire Indochina, and to weaken the Red Communist Party's power in Southeast Asia. Faced with Vietnam's aggressive offensive posture and its pressing military offensive, the little brothers of the United States in Southeast Asia panicked and asked the United States for help. The disastrous defeat in Vietnam just now by the United States has already seriously damaged its vitality. Coupled with the exhaustion of its national power, the United States is simply unable to launch military operations in Asia to stop Vietnam's offensive posture. The United States has turned its attention to China, hoping that China will exert its influence and curb Vietnam's expansionary ambitions and arrogance. Southeast Asian countries have also appealed to China for help. The United States used its economic strength in South Vietnam to set off wave after wave of refugees. At first, the United States and the West wanted to use the refugee wave to help pro-American businessmen and South Vietnamese government officials in South Vietnam who had no time to retreat to escape from Vietnam. Many of the refugees who escaped from Vietnam were successful people of Chinese descent in Vietnam, due to historical reasons. Capital and businessmen from Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore have been operating in South Vietnam for many years, and many overseas Chinese in Vietnam have achieved success in business and business. The United States and Western countries are keenly aware that they can use Vietnamese overseas Chinese to make a big fuss, kill two birds with one stone, and attempt to provoke the friendly relations between China and Vietnam that have existed for decades. With the help of the United States and Western countries, more and more overseas Chinese and ethnic Chinese have sold their assets and fled Vietnam. Pro-American forces have taken the opportunity to spread rumors, slandering that the overseas Chinese and ethnic Chinese are trying to hollow out the economy of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Immediately, a wave of persecution of overseas Chinese and ethnic Chinese quickly set off in southern Vietnam. Under the instigation of the United States and neighboring countries, and with the secret help of the southern Vietnamese government, what was originally a wave of refugees fleeing from Vietnam gradually evolved into a wave of anti-China and anti-Chinese, and it was soon controlled by the United States for many years. The South spread to central and northern Vietnam. Although the pro-China northern faction in Vietnam has repeatedly blocked it, however, the flames of nationalism in Vietnam have already been ignited, and it is too late for the pro-China faction to calm down. The United States adopted the method of intensifying the conflict between Vietnam and Cambodia, causing military conflicts between Vietnam and Cambodia, and causing the two brothers of the Communist Party in Indochina to fight each other and kill each other, completely disrupting the process of Vietnam's march into the Southeast Asian peninsula. The United States and Thailand sent pro-Thai forces in Cambodia to take the lead in launching an attack on the islands occupied by Vietnam. They also created military conflicts on the border between Cambodia and Vietnam. Attempts to create a military conflict between Cambodia and Vietnam have virtually turned Cambodia into a stumbling block to prevent Vietnam from expanding. At the same time, it can also divide China's support for Vietnam. If Vietnam loses China's support, it will be difficult for even the aid materials from the Soviet Union to be transported to Vietnam by land from China, and Vietnam will have no power to expand in Southeast Asia. In 1977, the conflict and military confrontation between Vietnam and Cambodia intensified. The Cambodian government is also feeling the pressure. In September 1977, Cambodian leader Pol Pot visited China publicly for the first time as General Secretary of the Communist Party of Cambodia and Prime Minister of Democratic Kampuchea. Pol Pot had visited China twice in private before. Hua Qiaoben, then chairman of the Communist Party of China and Prime Minister of the People's Republic of China, received General Secretary Pol Pot with a grand spectacle, and at the same time boarded the Tiananmen rostrum to review the 1977 National Day Parade. Due to the strong support of the Chinese government, Vietnam did not dare to do anything to Cambodia. The United States and the West turned to slander the Cambodian Communist Party and Pol Pot. Of course, Pol Pot's policies and strategies were indeed a bit eager for success, and he wanted to build Cambodia into the first prosperous and powerful socialist country in Southeast Asia within 5 years. Some practices are really unrealistic and aggressive. For example, let 3 million Phnom Penh citizens go to the countryside to build a new socialist modern countryside. Another example, abolish currency and wages, implement a communist supply system in Cambodia, everyone eats for free, free medical care, free housing, free reading, no money for anything, and they are all treated equally. The communist advances in Cambodia terrified the United States and the West, as well as the capitalist countries. The United States and Western countries have joined forces with Southeast Asian countries to sanction aggressive Cambodia, imposed a blockade, embargo, and infiltration on Cambodia, and instigated various forces to subvert and destroy Cambodia. The United States and the West took the opportunity to pour sewage on the Cambodian government and Pol Pot, slandering and spreading rumors all over the world. In an instant, the leaders of the Khmer Rouge fell directly from the altar to the abyss, becoming mysterious figures and heinous devils all over the world. This is the victory of the Western public opinion war. Extremes must be reversed. The United States slandered the Khmer Rouge and slandered Pol Pot all over the world. On December 25, 1978, Vietnam took advantage of the momentum of the United States and the West's attack on the Cambodian government to attack Cambodia with its five-way army. The democratic Cambodian commander Han Sanglin turned his back on the battlefield, and the capital Phnom Penh opened its doors. The Chinese ambassador also retreated directly to the mountains wrapped in a blanket. On January 7, 1979, the Vietnamese army occupied Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia. More than 30,000 troops of Democratic Kampuchea retreated to the mountainous area on the border between Cambodia and Thailand, and some Cambodian troops even entered the Thai border directly to avoid Vietnam's attack. People are not as good as God. The Vietnamese army approached the Cambodia-Thailand border, and repeatedly sent troops into Thailand's territory to encircle and suppress the Democratic Kampuchea army. The Americans got angry. President Carter of the United States urgently invited Chinese Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping to visit the White House of the United States during the Spring of China. He hoped that China and the United States would discuss ways and strategies to deal with the overwhelming offensive of the Vietnamese army. The United States hoped that China would send troops to punish Vietnam and save the entire Southeast Asia crisis facing. 3. The United States wins over and induces China to punish Vietnam. The United States failed miserably on the Vietnam battlefield, and its vitality was severely damaged, and it was already powerless to prevent Vietnam from marching into Southeast Asian countries. At this time, the United States began to plan for China, hoping to win over China and induce China to punish Vietnam and curb Vietnam's expansion ambitions, thereby helping the United States to stabilize its position in Southeast Asia. Over the years, China has tightened its belt to help Vietnam fight against the United States and has made great contributions. After Vietnam's reunification, it fell to the Soviet Union in an all-round way, which also made China unhappy. In addition, Vietnam was driven by Western countries to drive out Chinese nationals and oppress Cambodia, which was supported by China. China was also full of anger. Facing the temptation of the United States and the temptation of military materials, he was also moved and agreed to join hands with the United States to contain the expansion of Vietnam and the Soviet Union in Southeast Asia. However, the initial strategic cooperation between China and the United States was limited to the joint support of Democratic Kampuchea against Vietnam, thereby preventing Vietnam from expanding and penetrating into Southeast Asian countries such as Thailand. China was not prepared to directly use force against Vietnam. The United States has no extravagant expectation that China and Vietnam, two socialist countries that are comrades and brothers, will turn against each other and fight each other. The United States only hopes to provide military and economic assistance to China, and to indirect military assistance to Cambodia by strengthening China's military strength. The United States, on the other hand, strengthened its military forces in Southeast Asian countries such as Thailand and the Philippines as a backing to support China's efforts to stop Vietnam's expansion in Cambodia. 1. The United States instructed France to sell C-160 transport aircraft and Gazelle armed helicopters to China. China and Cambodia do not border each other and there are high mountains and long rivers. If China wants to provide military assistance to democratic Cambodia, it must first solve the problem of air transportation. The old aircraft such as the IL-18 and Trident equipped by the Chinese Air Force at that time were facing retirement, while transport aircraft such as the N-26 and N-24 were flying out of the country to project military power to Southeast Asia. China urgently needs medium-sized transport aircraft capable of air transport to Cambodia. In mid-1978, the United States agreed with France to sell the C-160 transport aircraft jointly produced by France and Germany to China. Since the C-160 is only equipped with two turboprop engines, the practical service ceiling is not high, which cannot meet China's military transportation needs on the Tibetan Plateau. China hopes that the United States will provide the American-made C-130 transport aircraft equipped with 4 engines, a high service ceiling and a greater load capacity. However, under the pretext of being restricted by the Batumi Committee, the U.S. government is temporarily unable to directly provide China with more advanced US C-130 transport aircraft. China believes that C-160 is also restricted by the Batumi Committee. Why can it be sold to China? Why can't C-130 be sold to China? C-130. Later, China's Civil Aviation Leasing introduced 2 C-130 civil version transport aircraft as the need for air transportation into Tibet. Because the 2 civilian C-130 transport planes provided by the United States are too severely castrated, they are not suitable for air transportation into Tibet. Later, the Soviet Union took the initiative to provide 2 154 transport aircraft and civilian passenger aircraft suitable for entering Tibet, and the U.S. transport aircraft lost a great opportunity to enter China. In 1978, France also transported the Little Antelope armed helicopter to a certain military airport in Beijing. 2. The United States presented China with 2 sets of advanced electronic warfare monitoring equipment. At that time, the United States provided China with 2 sets of advanced electronic monitoring equipment free of charge out of the need to monitor the Soviet Union. It is required to be installed in the Xinjiang region of China, focusing on monitoring the Central Asian region of the Soviet Union. The United States lacked monitoring methods for the Central Asian region of the Soviet Union back then, and the information obtained is shared by China and the United States. Back then, the main threat to China came from the threat of the Soviet Army with millions of soldiers to northeast China and North China. Xinjiang was too far away from the mainland of China, and it was very difficult for China to defend it. Therefore, China requested that 2 sets of electronic monitoring equipment provided by the United States be installed in Xinjiang and Northeast respectively to jointly monitor Soviet military information in Central Asia and the Far East. The United States initially disagreed, and China insisted on setting up a set in Northeast China. Otherwise, the United States would simply stop engaging in electronic surveillance in China. Because China is not very interested in the Soviet Union's military activities in Central Asia, and the electronic monitoring equipment of the United States is also dangerous to China's own military intelligence. The United States bypassed the Batumi Committee and the U.S. Congress and secretly provided these 3 sets of advanced electronic reconnaissance equipment to China, which played an important role in China's self-defense counterattack against Vietnam in 1979. After the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in December 1979, the United States and China formed a new alliance in jointly resisting the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan. The United States has upgraded the 2 electronic monitoring stations originally located in Xinjiang, and established 2 high-standard permanent electronic monitoring stations in Kitai in the north of Xinjiang and Korla in the south. Soviet listening post. The war between the Soviet Union and Afghanistan lasted for 10 years, and the Soviet Union withdrew its troops from Afghanistan in failure. However, the 2 electronic listening posts in Xinjiang continued to operate. In December 2009, U.S. Director of National Intelligence Blair made a special trip to Beijing to secretly participate in the celebration ceremony for the 30th anniversary of China's electronic monitoring stations. 3. The U.S. provided China with much-needed Sidewinder air-to-air missiles. In 1978, China's main fighter was still the J-6, and only a few dozen J-7s, an early model of the Soviet MiG-21 assembled in China, were mainly deployed in North China to defend the capital, Beijing. Although the Vietnamese Air Force has fewer numbers than China, its aircraft performance is better than that of China's main fighter jets. The Soviet Union provided the Vietnamese Air Force with the latest MiG-21. Performance was much superior to that of China's J-7 at the time, and the Soviet Union also provided Vietnam with a squadron of MiG-23 fighter jets equipped with a new generation of air-to-air missiles, plus a new generation of radar. The Chinese Air Force has thousands of fighters and has an absolute advantage in number. The new generation of MiG-21 and MiG-23 of the Vietnamese Air Force is better than China in terms of performance. The J-8 developed by China itself has completed its main flight test missions and is in the stage of qualitative and small batch production. Since the shape of the J-8 prototype is basically the same as that of the J-7, they all use head air intake. The nose cone is too small to install the radar and fire control system. The nose cone is too large and affects the air intake. Surge is prone to occur when the elevation angle is pulled up. Especially when 2 30mm cannons were first equipped to fire, thick smoke would enter the air intake of the nose, causing the aircraft to stop in the air, so the 2 cannons had to be removed. The supporting air-to-air missiles cannot keep up with the progress of aircraft research and development. A new type of aircraft with high altitude and high speed has been formed, and there is no embarrassing situation of supporting weapon systems. In order to win over China against the Soviet Union and punish Vietnam, the United States first acquiesced that France provided China with French-made air-to-air missiles through Pakistan, and China began to imitate air-to-air missiles. After the Soviet Union provided Vietnam with the MiG-23 Pioneer fighter that greatly surpassed China's J-7. The United States and France also exported a large number of French-made R-550 air-to-air missiles and American-made Sidewinder air-to-air missiles to Pakistan. Since the J-6 imported from China by Pakistan is equipped with a French or Italian fire control system, the Chinese J-6 equipped in Pakistan can launch the French R-550 air-to-air missile and the American Sidewinder missile, and Pakistan uses the J-66 launched missiles that beat the Indian Air Force to its knees and successfully shot down India's MiG-21 fighter jet. Therefore, the air-to-air missiles produced in France and the United States have become the emergency weapon system of China's new generation of J-8. The initial small batch of J-8s was mainly used for high-altitude reconnaissance and interception of MiG-23s. 4. The United States provided China with artillery school radar and anti-tank missiles. After China and the United States established formal diplomatic relations in January 1979, Sino-Soviet relations and Sino-Vietnamese relations became more and more tense. In particular, the situation on the Sino-Vietnamese border continues to be tense, and border conflicts occur from time to time. The trend of Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia and its march into Southeast Asia is also becoming more and more obvious. At this time, while urging China to take decisive measures to punish Vietnam, the United States stepped up efforts to provide China with urgently needed equipment and materials for the war against Vietnam. China is a country with a large army, and artillery is China's main weapon. If it is fighting against Vietnam, the accuracy of artillery is very important. However, China has long lacked artillery school radar. In 1979, the United States punished Vietnam in order to let China let go. The United States quietly provided China with a number of gun school radars, anti-tank missiles, infrared night vision devices, and other equipment and materials that China urgently needed. The U.S. military C-141 transport plane transported these equipment to a certain military airport in Beijing at night, and our planes directly transferred them to the front line. The author himself came back from a night flight and found that the parking space was occupied by a large black transport plane, so he had to slide to another place to stop. When I walked up to the black plane, I realized that it was a C-141 transport plane of the US military. After a while, the ground crew came and transferred the equipment from the US military plane to our transport plane. In the early hours of the morning, the US military C-141 took off and left. We then carried out an emergency mission to distribute these weapons and equipment directly to the front lines in Guangxi and Yunnan. The American Artillery School radar played an important role in the counterattack against Vietnam. Subsequently, 2 military factories in China dismantled 2 sets of US Artillery School radars for imitation. Since then, the weaponry and combat capabilities of the Chinese artillery have reached a new level. For many years, the Vietnamese artillery has been suppressed, and the Vietnamese artillery has never been able to lift its head. The imitated US anti-tank missiles are now the main combat weapon of the Chinese army. For China is not ready to enter Vietnam for military punishment. The United States has repeatedly suggested to China should punish Vietnam and prevent Vietnam from expanding into Southeast Asia. Although China agreed with the US proposal, China initially did not intend to use force to punish Vietnam. First, China and Vietnam are both socialist countries led by the Communist Party, with the same ideology and the same major strategic goals. They cannot fall into the US strategy of using the Communist Party to attack the Communist Party. The second is that China and Vietnam have been comrades and brothers for many years. The people and armies of the two countries have fought side by side against the US military for many years. Now they have to make a sudden turn to join the US in fighting Vietnam. Many senior officials and most soldiers are still unable to turn around. The third is that China believes that cutting off aid to Vietnam and cutting off the land channel of Soviet aid to Vietnam can already play a very effective role in sanctions. If the United States can provide channels and long-distance transportation tools, China can provide armed aid to Cambodian brothers, which not only defends China's little brother Cambodia, but also achieves the purpose of preventing Vietnam from annexing Cambodia and Laos, and effectively blocking Vietnam's expansion into Thailand and other Southeast Asian countries. Therefore, China was not initially prepared to fight Vietnam. 1. The Chinese army has not been equipped with military maps of northern Vietnam for a long time. Although China's frontline troops have already made defensive strategic deployments. However, initially the Chinese army did not consider entering Vietnamese territory to attack Vietnam militarily, and did not plan to directly engage in a military war with Vietnam. Therefore, China's combat troops on the front lines of Guangxi and Yunnan were not equipped with military maps for entering Vietnam. It should have been that the soldiers and horses were not moved, and the food and grass went first. If they want to enter Vietnam for military punishment, they must equip all participating troops with the latest military combat maps of northern Vietnam in advance. Otherwise, Chinese troops would not be able to fight effectively in Vietnam. On November 10, 1978, the longest and historically significant meeting, the Central Work Conference, was held in Beijing. The meeting was initially chaired by Hua Qiaoben, chairman of the party's Central Committee and chairman of the Military Commission, but the direction of the meeting changed in the middle of the meeting, causing Hua Qiaoben to lose power in the party, government, and military. It is inevitable that China and Vietnam will meet each other in arms. On November 23, 1978, the Central Military Commission convened the PLA General Staff Headquarters, General Political Department, General Logistics Department, Air Force Command, Navy Command, 2nd Artillery Command, Guangzhou Military Region, and Kunming Military Region to discuss the formulation of a military policy to punish Vietnam. Plan. The General Staff, the Guangzhou Military Region, and the Kunming Military Region all felt that the preparation time for the campaign was too tight, and the dry season in the south was about to pass. After the rainy season came, it would be impossible to effectively launch a major campaign. According to Mao Zedong's military thinking, do not fight unprepared battles, do not fight unsure battles. It is suggested to provide military aid to Cambodia to fight against Vietnam first, prepare for military struggle on the east and west fronts of Guangxi and Yunnan, and wait for the autumn to fight a punitive war with preparation and actual gains. This suggestion was not endorsed by the Central Military Commission. The General Staff Headquarters, the Guangzhou Military Region, and the Kunming Military Region jointly revised the combat plan, and decided to use our Army's powerful artillery group and the power of long-range cannons. The range of Chinese cannons far exceeds that of the cannons equipped by the Vietnamese artillery and the captured American cannons. The Lao-Pi arsenal has produced the cannon with the longest range in the world, and it has been equipped with field army troops, and it can be sure to win against the Vietnamese artillery. Using the shells hoarded for decades of war preparations and about to be scrapped to hit Vietnam, one is to vent a bad breath, the other is that the border artillery battle will not bring heavy casualties to both sides, and the two countries will meet again in the future. The third is to fight vigorously. 1 month, just to dispose of the shells that are going to be scrapped. Disposing of expired shells is dangerous and costly, and at the same time, it is easy to do business with the Americans. The CMC initially adopted the second option. As the United States haggled over the communique on the establishment of diplomatic relations between China and the United States and the Taiwan issue, the United States demanded that China should take military punishment actions that would actually shock the effect. The battle plan was revised again: select a few targets close to the Vietnamese border, and try to wipe out 1 to 2 enemy divisions in 3 to 5 days. In the end, it was decided to use ground troops to intersperse behind the Vietnamese border guards, attack the Vietnamese troops on the border from all sides, and fight a quick border punitive war. The third combat plan was approved by the Central Military Commission, and the United States is also very satisfied with this plan. On December 7, 1978, Deng Xiaoping presided over an enlarged meeting of the Central Military Commission, and on December 8 issued a decision and order to the entire army to fight back in self-defense against Vietnam. The enlarged meeting of the Military Commission decided to establish the Eastern Front Command. General Su Shiu, the commander of the Guangzhou Military Region, served as the commander-in-chief of the Eastern Front, and the Western Front Command. General Yang Dezi was transferred from the Jinan Military Region to the Kunming Military Region commander as the Western Front Commander, and the Deputy General Staff of the Military Commission General Yang Yong served as the leader of the coordination group of the frontline headquarters of the Military Commission, and the 3 founding generals were responsible for jointly formulating specific operational plans and deployments to the Central Military Commission. All units of the Army entered a state of combat readiness, and the 34th Air Force Division of the Air Force dispatched special planes on duty to the headquarters of the major military regions. China's war against Vietnam officially kicked off. The Carter administration of the United States was overjoyed to see that China finally took practical actions. The United States immediately negotiated with China to restore diplomatic relations between the two countries and provide military assistance. On December 9, 1978, Deng Xiaoping, Vice Chairman of the Military Commission, personally appointed General Su Shiu as Commander-in-Chief of the Eastern Front, Guangxi Direction, and General Yang Dezi as Commander-in-Chief of the Western Front, Yunnan Direction, and issued a written appointment order. The Central Military Commission approved the latest combat plan submitted by the General Staff: select targets close to the Vietnamese border, and strive to wipe out 1 to 2 enemy divisions in 3 to 5 days. The Central Military Commission requires: concentrate superior forces and make quick decisions. Subsequently, the Central Military Commission issued an order to the Army, Navy, and Air Force and major military regions to launch a strategic launch of self-defense counterattacks against Vietnam, and the troops participating in the war began to urgently gather troops to the Sino-Vietnamese border. Military map. Since the Chinese Army has not sent ground combat troops to Vietnam for many years, the Chinese Army mainly dispatched anti-aircraft artillery troops, radar and communication command troops, railway troops and engineering troops. China did not make military maps for fighting in the mountains of northern Vietnam. The Soviet Army did have military combat maps for the whole of Vietnam, but it was impossible for the Soviet Union to provide combat maps to China. If the Chinese Army does not have a reliable military map, how can ground combat troops go deep into Vietnam to fight? Facing the problem of incomplete map information, China is unable to conduct aerial surveying and mapping. Seeing that China's combat plan of dispatching ground troops deep into Vietnam is facing a challenge too. At the critical moment, the military satellites of the U.S. military provided satellite maps of the northern border area of Vietnam. China used the satellite map data provided by the U.S., combined with China's original old map data and the Vietnamese military map data captured by the border guards. After repeated verification, the first batch of military combat maps was urgently produced. On January 2, 1979, the aircraft of the 34th Division of the Air Force performed an emergency mission and urgently transported several tons of military maps that went deep into Vietnam to the frontline headquarters. Only then did the urgent need to enter the Vietnam War be resolved. 2. The Chinese Air Force is not ready to go deep into northern Vietnam. Although the Chinese Air Force has assembled a huge fleet in Guangxi, Yunnan, and its surrounding airports, Most of these fleets are mainly fighters and a small number of attack aircraft. The main combat mission of the Air Force is to carry out homeland defense operations. On January 28, 1979, Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping visited the United States. After the successful talks between Deng Xiaoping at the White House and President Carter of the United States, China and the United States reached a major strategic consensus on punishing Vietnam. The leaders of China and the United States formally made a joint decision. China will send ground troops into the northern border of Vietnam to punish Vietnam, and the United States will mobilize deterrent forces including aircraft carriers and strategic nuclear weapons to contain and suppress the Soviet Army, so as to ensure that the Soviet Army does not take the opportunity to find excuses to attack China. The northern border retaliated with force. With the guarantee from President Carter of the United States and the generals of the United States to suppress the Soviet Army with all their strength, China's worries about the Soviet Union's million-strong army suppressing the border were eased. In early February 1979, China finally made up its mind to send troops into Vietnam to carry out powerful military punishment operations. In order to support the ground forces penetrating into Vietnam, it is necessary to prepare for large-scale bombing of military targets and strategic targets in northern Vietnam by large bombers such as the H-6. The Air Force's bomber group transition began to enter the front-line battlefield. On February 14, 1979, the 34th Division of the Air Force urgently transported the bomber guidance groups of the Air Force of the Nanjing Military Region, the Air Force of the Lanzhou Military Region, and the Air Force of the Beijing Military Region to the front-line airport. When the bomber guidance group went to the front line, it was ready to dispatch large bombers such as the H-6 to go deep into Vietnam's airspace to carry out carpet bombing. The Air Force guidance group was sent to the front on the 14th, and the troops secretly entered Vietnam at night on the 16th. The time left for the Air Force Bomber H and the guidance group to run in was very short. Obviously, the Chinese army has not made preparations for going deep into Vietnam in advance. The rush of the Chinese army to enter Vietnam is mainly due to the demand of the United States. 3. The commander of the Air Force 36th Division H-6 crashed into the mountain and died gloriously. On February 17, 1979, the self-defense counterattack on the Vietnam border officially started. The early morning artillery bombardment of the Chinese army stunned the Vietnamese army, because the Vietnamese army did not expect that the old big brother China would really punish them severely. Since the main force of Vietnam was drawn to fight in the direction of Cambodia and defend the capital Hanoi, the main forces remaining on the Sino-Vietnamese border were non-main forces and local troops. However, it is precisely these local troops who are familiar with the environment and adopt guerrilla tactics relying on favorable terrain, and it is difficult for the regular Chinese troops to adapt and deal with them for a while. Both the Eastern Front and Western Front commands considered dispatching Air Force bombers to bomb important strongholds in Vietnam. Since the Vietnamese local forces are relatively small and scattered, dispatching large bombers such as the H-6 requires new tactics. In addition, the Vietnamese Air Force has relatively strong air defense firepower during the day, and the Vietnamese local troops do not have radar and night vision equipment, and their air defense capabilities at night are relatively weak. Therefore, the bomber unit of the Chinese Air Force has studied a new set of tactics specifically aimed at the scattered small targets of the Vietnamese local forces. The 36th Aviation Division is the bomber unit with the most H-6 equipment in China. It mainly carries out large-scale strategic bombing missions and strategic nuclear strike missions. Faced with local Vietnamese troops and scattered small targets, the continuous bombing of large bombers such as the H-6 at night, ultra-low altitude, and small targets is a new and difficult task. Division Commander Liang Ping took the lead in testing the new tactics for the first time. The division commander himself acted as the captain, the head of the regiment served as the pilot, and was equipped with the chief and director of the pilot bombing section and the chief and director of the communication shooting section. The main professional backbone and elites of the whole division were concentrated to take the lead in overcoming this big problem. It is already difficult for large bombers such as the H-6 to bomb small targets at night, and it is even more difficult to bomb at ultra-low altitude at night. In addition, it is very difficult to carry out continuous bombing of multiple small targets. The avionics system of the old-fashioned H-6 was still relatively backward, and it was very difficult to carry out such a complicated bombing mission. In the middle of the night on February 19, 1979, the crew on duty was woken up to carry out an emergency mission and sent Wu Fuxian, Deputy Commander of the Air Force, to the 36th Division of the Air Force. Commander Liang Ping's crew was conducting training on the night of the 19th to overcome the difficult problem of continuous bombing of small targets at ultra-low altitudes. Unfortunately, the H-6 plane crashed into a mountain. All 6 crew members including the commander were killed. The 6 martyrs will always inspire the Air Force soldiers to fight bravely. Due to the heavy fog at Wujiang Airport, the meteorological standard for the aircraft to land at night could not be met. The crew was on standby until the morning of the 20th, when the weather conditions at the landing site improved, and then took off to send Deputy Commander Wu of the Air Force to the 36th Division. A large number of historical events show from the side that the preparation time for the self-defense counterattack against Vietnam was too short and the military preparations were not sufficient. The final combat plan was determined at the White House in early February, but the dry season was coming to an end, forcing the capital Hanoi. However, the intelligence and suggestions provided by the United States influenced the military plan at a critical moment. On March 5th, China hastily announced that it would withdraw its troops from Vietnam before March 15th. Winning or losing does not matter. If it wants to fight, it is also the United States, and if it wants to withdraw, it is also the United States. China follows the US buttocks, and it is always China who suffers and is fooled. China should learn from the experience and lessons of the United States. 5. Finalize the use of force in the Oval Office. At that time, the Soviet Union deployed millions of soldiers, 10,000 tanks, and 3,000 combat aircraft on the northern border of China, overwhelming China. The Indian border has also been turbulent, as have Tibet and Xinjiang. The US military garrisons in South Korea and Japan are also a major constraint on China's southeast direction. Taiwan has always been China's biggest strategic burden. Taiwan has often caused troubles and resorted to various tricks to promote Taiwan's independence. One China, one Taiwan, and 2 Chinas. At that time, China was already besieged on all sides, and the international strategic environment was already very bad. If China goes to war against Vietnam on the Sino-Vietnamese border again, China's only southwest rear area will be gone. Therefore, China has been reluctant to take military action against Vietnam in accordance with the requirements of the United States. The Americans had no choice but to abandon their pawns and abandon Taiwan to induce China to punish Vietnam by force. 1. The United States is determined to use Taiwan as a bait to induce China to punish Vietnam by force. Who wanted to punish Vietnam the most? The Americans were more anxious than the Chinese. First, the Americans could not swallow the anger of the fiasco in Vietnam. Second, the United States must not allow Vietnam to continue to grow in Southeast Asia. Therefore, the Americans used Taiwan as a bait and used Taiwan as a bargaining chip in exchange for China to punish Vietnam by force. In order to reassure China about the Taiwan issue, the United States suppresses Taiwan while creating a peaceful atmosphere on both sides of the strait. If China wants to exchange fire with Vietnam in the south, once the battle becomes serious, in addition to the coordinated operations of the ground forces and the air force, the Navy must also participate in the battle. Vietnam has a narrow territory, a long coastline, and the weakest navy in Vietnam. If China really wants to solve the Vietnam problem once and for all, attacking and landing from the sea, cutting Vietnam into several sections, encircling and annihilating is the best strategy and tactic. Back then, the South China Sea Fleet was the weakest fleet in the Chinese Navy. To use the Navy in the Vietnam battlefield, it is necessary to transfer warships from the powerful North Sea Fleet and East China Sea Fleet to the south to support the North Sea Fleet. In order to resist the Soviet Union's military threat to Northeast China and North China, ships could not be dispatched from the North Sea Fleet, but ships from the East Sea Fleet could only be dispatched to the south. At that time, the Chinese Navy's long-distance combat capability was still relatively weak, and the Air Force's fighter jets had relatively short legs. It was difficult for the ships of the East China Sea Fleet to sail southward from the island chain to sail from the waters off Taiwan to the South China Sea Fleet. It can only cross the Taiwan Strait, relying on strong shore-based air defense and anti-ship forces, and under the protection of land-based aviation units, it can be transferred to the South China Sea Fleet. The United States has repeatedly assured China, Taiwan is safe and sound, and the Taiwan Strait is calm. However, the Central Military Commission is still worried about Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait. On October 1, 1978, the mission of the Special Plane of the 34th Division of the Ministry of Aviation, to send a group of dozens of generals from the 3 Army Joint Investigation Team led by Minister Lee of the Operation Department of the General Staff to observe the terrain along the coast, mainly the coast of Zhejiang and Fujian and the Taiwan Strait. After a few turns around Putuo Island in the East China Sea Fleet, the plane flew along the coast of Zhejiang province to the Taiwan Strait. When flying to Dongyan Island, the plane made a special slope, and dozens of generals squeezed into one porthole to look at Dongyan Island. The red flags fluttering on the island, I thought it was an island of the mainland, but upon closer inspection, it was the blue sky, white sun, and red flags all over the ground of Taiwan. Under the suppression of the United States, the Kuomintang army in Taiwan did not disturb at that time, and the overall situation in the Taiwan Strait was relatively stable. Our troops deployed in the Fuzhou military region and Nanjing military region were also very strong. In addition, in order to reassure China in punishing Vietnam in the south, the U.S. troops stationed in Japan and South Korea stopped their military activities against China and concentrated their forces on suppressing Russia's naval and air forces in the Far East. The General Staff of the Central Military Commission led the Army, Navy, and Air Force Command and the 2nd Artillery Command and other senior generals to the Taiwan Strait to actually look at the terrain, conduct an actual investigation of the combat readiness of the Fujian front line, and conduct a comprehensive assessment of the overall coastal air defense and coastal defense. Fleet ships can cross the Taiwan Strait to support the South China Sea Fleet in its operations against Vietnam. This played a big role in the formulation of the combat plan against Vietnam on November 23, 1978 and the decision of the Central Military Commission to fight back in self-defense against Vietnam on December 7. The Sino-Vietnamese border self-defense counterattack was the result of the struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. On September 29, 1978, Vietnam joined the Soviet-led Committee for Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon. For the purpose of containing China, the Soviet Union signed the Soviet-Vietnam Friendship and Cooperation Treaty with military assistance on November 3, 1978, to support Vietnam's expansion in the Indochina Peninsula. The comprehensive cooperation between the Soviet Union and Vietnam was booming, and the large amount of advanced weapons and equipment left by the U.S. military made Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and other Southeast Asian capitalist countries shudder. The Americans were desperate and helpless. Just at this time, major changes took place in China's top leadership, and the United States quickly seized this opportunity to improve relations with China. Some foreigners now think that after the third plenary session of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China in 1978, the United States believed that China opened the door to reform and opening up. Therefore, the United States established diplomatic relations with China and encouraged China to open up to the Western world and carry out reforms. In fact, these foreigners do not really understand this period of Chinese history. During the Central Work Conference held on November 10, 1978, major changes occurred in the middle. The real power of the Central Committee and the Central Military Commission had undergone fundamental changes in early December. Hua Qiaobin handed over power smoothly after the review, and Deng Xiaoping quietly returned. The United States is keenly aware of the new changes in China and rejoices. The Americans seized the opportunity and finalized the main contents of the communique on the establishment of formal diplomatic relations with China as quickly as possible. On the second day, 16, when the Central Work Conference closed on November 15, 1978, China and the United States simultaneously announced the Sino-US Joint Communique on the Establishment of Diplomatic Relations. From January 1, 1979, China and the United States formally established diplomatic relations at the ambassadorial level. Relation. The United States recognizes that the People's Republic of China is the sole legal government of China and that Taiwan is an inalienable part of China. The United States announced the severance of the so-called diplomatic relations with Taiwan, and the withdrawal of U.S. troops stationed in Taiwan within 1979, terminating the US-Taiwan Mutual Defense Treaty. The Americans were willing to abandon their punts to save the cart at the critical moment, and broke off diplomatic relations, abolished the contract, and withdrew troops in one go. This makes Taiwan, which has been a small follower of the United States for decades, be in a bleak situation and want to cry without tears. The two big countries, China and the United States, came together suddenly and dramatically, and the pressure on the Soviet Union was also very heavy at that time. The position of the Soviet Union in the Sino-US-Soviet triangle immediately became unfavorable. The Soviet Union also saw clearly that the United States was a drunkard who didn't want to drink. The move made by the United States at this time is not only to punish Vietnam and curb Vietnam's expansion to Southeast Asia, but the Americans are laying out a bigger game. Only the Vietnamese did not wake up, and dared to send troops to Cambodia on December 25, 1978 under the circumstances of China and the United States announcing a major strategic change in the establishment of diplomatic relations. 3. Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping made an emergency visit to the United States on the first day of the Spring Festival in 1979. On December 14, 1978, U.S. time, December 15, Chinese time, just after the Central Working Conference, U.S. President Carter sent an invitation to visit the U.S. from the White House to Deng Xiaoping, the new leader of China. To President Carter's surprise, Mr. Deng Xiaoping quickly made a decision within 24 hours, to accept President Carter's invitation and plan to visit the United States when the spring blossoms. Please note that December 15th is before the third plenary session of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. Obviously, U.S. President Carter had already obtained accurate information that Deng Xiaoping became the new leader of China at this time. On December 25, 1978, Vietnamese troops suddenly began a full-scale invasion of Cambodia. Vietnam's 18 divisions with more than 200,000 elite troops launched a lightning raid from the Cambodia-Vietnam border in northeast Cambodia. Cambodia did not expect that the Red Vietnamese brother would really fight against the Communist Party, and he was not prepared for military struggle. Originally, Cambodia's military power was no match for Vietnam. In addition, Vietnam and the United States and the Soviet Union were working at the same time, and a three-pronged strategy rebelled against a group of important military generals such as Han Sang-lin, the division commander of the Cambodian Army and secretary of the Khmer Provincial Party Committee. The entire defense line of Cambodia it suddenly collapsed. At noon on January 7, 1979, the Democratic Kampuchea government hastily withdrew from Phnom Penh, the capital city, to the Cambodia-Thailand border in western Cambodia. The Democratic Kampuchea established by the Khmer Rouge was overthrown by the Red Vietnam, and the entire Cambodia was occupied by Vietnam. The situation has changed suddenly. At this moment, both China and the United States feel the severity and tension of the situation in Southeast Asia. The leaders of the two countries urgently need to have face-to-face strategic consultations as soon as possible to jointly discuss and finalize major strategic guidelines and specific punishment measures. The leaders of China and the United States originally agreed to visit during the spring season, but now the situation in Cambodia has undergone major changes. If Vietnam is to be punished by force, half of the dry season has passed, and a major battle cannot be launched once the rainy season comes. Therefore, the meeting between the leaders of China and the United States was moved forward to the severe cold season with heavy snowfall, and it was held during the Spring Festival in China. This is also a very rare emergency arrangement in China. January 28, 1979 is the first day of the Chinese Lunar New Year. On this day, China's new leader Deng Xiaoping, whose public title was still Vice Premier of the State Council of China when he visited the United States, set off for an emergency visit to the United States. Because of the transoceanic intercontinental flight, the Trident plane of the 34th Division of the Air Force does not have enough range. Su Bailing, director of the Beijing Civil Aviation Administration, is flying the special plane. The plane is a Boeing 707 imported from the United States by Civil Aviation. The leaders of China and the United States jointly decided to use force to punish Vietnam in the Oval Office. On January 28, 1979, President Carter of the United States received Chinese Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping at the White House with a 19-gun salute that the outside world considered extremely grand. In fact, the United States did not break the standard, but arranged the reception standard according to the standard of Deng Xiaoping's undisclosed actual position. During Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping's visit to the United States, he held 3 talks with U.S. President Carter. Before attending the state dinner, President Carter held a small private meeting with Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping in the Oval Office of the White House. The content of the talks is the core of this visit, the Vietnam issue and the Soviet Union issue. Other issues have already been negotiated by the contact groups and officials of the two sides. Only the Vietnam issue and the Soviet Union issue, which both sides are most concerned about and most urgent, require the leaders of the two countries to meet face-to-face and make a decision. China believes that China's basic attitude is still based on the economic sanctions that have a great impact on Vietnam, such as the suspension of aid to Vietnam and the suspension of the Soviet Union's overland aid to Vietnam. The Vietnamese army, and China is preparing to use tens of thousands of artillery bombardments on the Sino-Vietnamese border to carry out a deterrent military strike on the border area of Vietnam, which not only achieves the purpose of military punishment, but also avoids a large number of casualties on both sides. The United States believes that China only takes these three punitive measures to impose limited penalties on Vietnam, and cannot quickly and effectively contain Vietnam's military threats in Cambodia and Southeast Asia. The United States insists that only when China dispatches ground troops into Vietnam to form a high-pressure situation can it drag back the Vietnamese troops who invaded Cambodia and ease the concerns of Southeast Asian countries. Of course, the United States also proposed to control the number of Chinese troops entering Vietnam within a certain number, and the scope of going deep into Vietnam should also be limited. The Chinese side believed that the Soviet Union and Vietnam had just signed the Soviet-Vietnamese Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation, and China dispatched ground troops into Vietnam. The Soviet Union might cause trouble on the Sino-Soviet border. This put military pressure on Northeast and North China. Moreover, the Soviet Union has sent naval ships to Vietnam to help Vietnam cruise the Big Gulf. The U.S. guarantees that during China's punishment of Vietnam, the U.S. armed forces will enter a state of combat readiness. The U.S. Strategic Missile Force, Navy, and Air Force will conduct deterrent cruises against the Soviet Army. The U.S. 7th Fleet sent ships into the Gulf of Tonkin and the Sea of Japan to suppress the Soviet Navy. Moreover, the United States will issue clear orders to ensure that the Soviet Union receives the U.S. military deterrence information. China agreed to adopt the plan insisted by the United States to send ground troops into Vietnam for punitive operations. However, the scale of the war should be limited to the scope of the border war, and the name of the battle was set as Sino-Vietnamese Border Self-Defense Counterattack. Moreover, the U.S. can only secretly help China punish Vietnam militarily, and the U.S. cannot openly support China in sending troops. Because after all, this is an armed struggle between two socialist countries, it still has a negative impact on the entire socialist country, and it will also have a negative impact on third world countries. If the United States is openly involved in or openly supports punitive actions, it will create the impression that China and the United States are jointly bullying Vietnam, which is not good, and it is not easy for China to explain to the third world countries. China's military punishment of Vietnam should be based on the obvious reasons of Vietnam's anti-China and anti-Chinese and provoking border conflicts, and it should not mention Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia and threats to Southeast Asia. The United States believes that China's considerations are more comprehensive. The anti-war voice in the United States is also relatively high, and it is not convenient for the United States to get involved in the Vietnam War again with open flames. The United States only helps and assists China secretly, and it is easy to explain to the American people and to its allies. Carter said, "This is easy to handle. The U.S. government will draft a statement. When they meet again tomorrow, they will publicly read, the U.S. does not support the use of force to resolve the border issue." The leaders of China and the United States finally made a final decision in the Oval Office of the White House. China and the United States will cooperate strategically, and China will dispatch ground troops to carry out punitive military strikes on Vietnam before the dry season ends. The U.S. armed forces were responsible for containing the Soviet Army, and the U.S. quietly supported the Chinese military to punish Vietnam. The leaders of China and the United States are very satisfied with the results of this small-scale talks. Subsequently, the leaders of the two countries stepped into the banquet hall and toasted together at the state banquet to celebrate the major breakthroughs in the strategic cooperation between China and the United States. The next morning, President Carter read an open letter to Deng Xiaoping verbatim in public. The United States opposes China's punitive military strikes against Vietnam, hopes that the two countries can resolve border conflicts peacefully, and hopes that other countries will not interfere in the conflict between China and Vietnam. After the public drama between China and the United States was over, the senior officials of the two countries immediately discussed the cooperation plans between China and the United States in the economic and technological fields, as well as the economic assistance provided by the United States to China. 6 gains and losses in the self-defense counterattack against Vietnam in 1979. Finally, briefly summarize the gains and losses of this war. 1. Strategic cooperation with the United States to punish Vietnam is beneficial to the subsequent reform and opening up. On February 5, 1979, U.S. time, Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping concluded his visit to the U.S. and achieved fruitful results. First of all, China and the United States have established a substantive strategic cooperative relationship, which will open the door for China's future reform and opening up. At the same time, China received substantial economic and military assistance from the United States for the first time. The most important thing is to finalize the strategic cooperation between China and the United States, jointly punish Vietnam and jointly contain the Soviet Union. It laid the foundation and strengthened confidence for the self-defense counterattack on the Vietnam border that was unveiled 11 days later. It opened the door to cooperation between China and the United States in the fields of intelligence exchange and military affairs. From February 6 to 8, 1979, Beijing time, Deng Xiaoping, who had finished his visit to the United States, stopped by Japan. Deng Xiaoping informed Japanese Prime Minister Masahiro Ohira of his visit to the United States, and extensively exchanged views on the international situation, the Asia-Pacific region, and bilateral relations of common concern to both China and Japan, and reached consensus. Stabilizing Sino-Japanese relations is conducive to China's military punishment of Vietnam. The Chinese army has not fought a war for many years, and this self-defense counterattack against the Vietnam border has greatly tempered the troops. The troops have summed up a lot of modern combat experience and many lessons through actual combat. 2. The United States crossed the river and demolished the bridge, lied about the Soviet Union's military situation, and China hastily withdrew its troops. On February 16, 1979, Chinese interspersed troops began to covertly intersect in the predetermined area. In the early morning of February 17, 1979, the 21st day of the first lunar month in the lunar calendar, more than 200,000 Chinese troops, including 9 army, 29 infantry divisions, launched an attack on 11 counties in 6 provinces on the northern border of Vietnam from Guangxi, Eastern Front, and Yunnan, West Front, at the same time. Tens of thousands of artillery guns from our army fired together, and the flames soared into the sky. Suddenly, I felt that the Vietnamese army was in trouble when I was still sleeping, and the self-defense counterattack against the Vietnamese border officially started. The Air Force has assembled more than 1,000 fighters on the eastern and western fronts. Some of the fighters took off from the front-line airports and patrolled the air along our side of the border, ready to attack incoming enemy aircraft and provide air cover for ground troops when needed. Some warships of the South China Sea Fleet entered the Bibu Gulf to patrol and defend oil platforms and maintain the safety and smoothness of waterways. The Vietnamese army did not deploy the main force on the border. Because Vietnam occupied favorable terrain, had many years of actual combat experience and rich experience in mountain guerrilla warfare, the Chinese army fought very hard in this border war where the strong beat the weak and were sure to win. It was during the battle against Jiaoping City that the battle went very badly, and I had to go down to rectify and mobilize flamethrower companies from various field troops to burn the mouse holes. After the baptism of war and summing up experience and lessons, the Chinese army fought better and better. On March 4th, the Chinese army successfully captured Lang Son, a military fortress in Vietnam, and annihilated the Vietnamese army in Saba. After our army took Liangshan at a great price, the main positions in the border area have been completely occupied and controlled by our army. Looking at Hanoi, the capital of Vietnam, it is already flat, and our army's vanguard has already approached Hanoi. The balance of war is completely tilted towards China. The United States, as a strategic ally, is pleased with China's victory on the one hand, and has reached the strategic goal originally designed by the Americans. At the same time, the mentality of the Americans has also changed. The United States is worried that China is now victorious, and the war is getting smoother. The capital Hanoi is no longer safe to defend, and the door is wide open. The main force of the Vietnamese army is trapped in Cambodia and cannot rush to rescue in time. If the fight continues, Hanoi, the capital of Vietnam, will soon be captured. Once China quickly captures Hanoi, the capital of Vietnam, it will set off even greater waves in Southeast Asia, which will cause China's more terrifying another domino effect in Southeast Asia, and Southeast Asian countries are likely to fall to China in an all-round way. Therefore, the United States formally requires the Chinese military to stop advancing and end military punishment operations as soon as possible. The soldiers of the People's Liberation Army on the front line at that time resolutely opposed a hasty withdrawal of troops. They sacrificed so many comrades in arms. The generals of the Eastern Front Command, the Western Front Command and the Military Commission Coordination Group all agreed that even if the Chinese army wanted to withdraw, all armies should advance tens of kilometers and approach the city of Hanoi. After Vietnam was convinced to withdraw again. However, the pressure from the United States has continued one after another, and the false intelligence of the United States has come one after another. For a while, it is said that the strategic bombers of the Soviet Air Force have begun to mobilize, unwilling to confront the Soviet Union directly. If China does not withdraw its troops, it will be difficult for the United States to assist China once the Soviet army takes action, and so on. At that time, the Soviet Union deployed more than 1 million mechanized troops, more than 3,000 advanced combat aircraft, and more than 10,000 tanks on the Chinese border. The pressure faced by Northeast and North China was unprecedented. Faced with the pressure of the Americans breaking the bridge, breaking the contract immediately after reaching the strategic goal of the United States, reneging on their promises at critical moments, and blatantly threatening that the United States may let go of their hands, the Chinese government hastily announced a unilateral ceasefire on March 5. Withdraw all Chinese troops from Vietnam by March 15. At that time, Commander Su Shiao, the commander-in-chief of the Eastern Front, was very dissatisfied with the hasty withdrawal of troops, and was so angry that he scolded his mother in the Shin Command post in Nanning. The halfway border war greatly reduced the effect of military punishment on Vietnam. Chinese soldiers shed blood and tears, and the lesson is very profound. On April 26, 1979, Dr. Henry Kissinger, former U.S. National Security Advisor, made a special trip to China for issues such as the war against Vietnam. When Deng Xiaoping met with Kissinger, he summarized the experience and lessons of the just concluded self-defense counterattack against Vietnam. Deng Xiaoping said to Kissinger, in retrospect, if we could go a little deeper when punishing Vietnam, the effect might be better. There is no line of defense. We have enough troops to fight all the way to Hanoi. Kissinger replied, yes, it was not difficult to win Hanoi at that time. But that may be beyond our mutually agreed plan. Deng Xiaoping said with a smile, although China does not necessarily want to occupy Hanoi, but we at least another 30 kilometers can be advanced, so the strategic effect will be more ideal. 3. The Soviet Union did not take action against China, and Sino-Soviet relations remained stable. The Soviet Union supported Vietnam in choosing to side with the Soviet Union in the Sino-Soviet confrontation, and the Soviet Union supported Vietnam's expansion into Southeast Asia. However, since the struggle for hegemony between the Socialist Soviet Union and the capitalist United States was the main goal. Although the Soviet Union was also very dissatisfied with Socialist China. However, even when the Sino-Soviet War broke out on Jinbao Island in 1969, the Soviet Union still exercised restraint. Because the Soviet Union clearly knew that pushing a big country like China into the arms of the United States would not be in the national interests of the Soviet Union, nor would it be in the interests of the entire communist camp. On February 17, 1979, China really went to war against Vietnam. The Vietnamese government did not estimate it, nor did the Soviet government. From the intercepted communications between the Vietnamese leadership and the front line, and from the panicked communication between the Vietnamese leaders and the Soviet leaders, it can be seen that both Vietnam and the Soviet Union misjudged China's determination and courage. On the morning of February 17, the Vietnamese leader urgently asked the Soviet leader for help. The Soviet leader did not reply immediately, but first directly asked the Soviet Far Eastern Military District Command. After learning that there was no conflict on the Sino-Soviet border, the Soviet leaders breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that China's military action was only to punish Vietnam, not against the Soviet Union. Only then did the Soviet leader ask the Vietnamese leader whether Hanoi had been attacked by air. After learning that China had not dispatched planes and that Hanoi had not been attacked by air, the Soviet leader replied to the Vietnamese leader, keep calm and hold your ground, don't let the war escalate, don't dispatch the Air Force and Navy. Soviet leaders did not immediately commit to providing military support to Vietnam. Later, the Soviet Union saw that the Chinese army encountered resistance on the Sino-Vietnamese border, and the progress of the battle was slow. Vietnam transferred several divisions from Cambodia and the south to defend Hanoi. The People's Liberation Army also did not dispatch air force to support ground forces. The Soviet Union judged that the scale of the Sino-Vietnamese border war was limited, and the Soviet Union did not need to be directly involved, leaving an opportunity for Sino-Soviet reconciliation. Therefore, the Soviet army has remained normal and has not raised the combat readiness level of the Soviet Far East troops. After the People's Liberation Army conquered the capital cities of Vietnam, such as Cao Vinh and Lang Son, the cover of the Soviet Union remained on hold. Only the Soviet Foreign Ministry raised its voice of condemnation. On the contrary, the United States was impatient and misreported the false news of the large-scale mobilization of the Soviet army many times in surprise, and urged China to withdraw its troops many times, fearing that the Chinese army would really occupy Hanoi, the capital of Vietnam, in one fell swoop. The false news provided by the United States also caused Commander Su Shiao's near-obtained army to come to naught under the city of Hanoi, the capital of Vietnam. Many years later in the summer, the author stepped into the chairman's palace in Hanoi, the capital of Vietnam, but not as a victor, but as a tourist. Instead, American soldiers and aircraft carriers swaggered back to Vietnam. For after China announced its withdrawal, the United States immediately changed its face and passed the Taiwan Relations Act. After the United States achieved its goal of using China to punish Vietnam and contain Vietnam's expansion to Southeast Asia, it not only postponed the fulfillment of various commitments to China with excuses. Even the promise on the Taiwan issue that was written in black and white in the communication on the establishment of diplomatic relations between China and the United States before the ink was dry began to go back. On March 13, 1979, when the main force of China basically withdrew to China, the U.S. Congress violated the communication on the establishment of diplomatic relations between China and the United States and openly passed the Taiwan Relations Act that interfered in China's internal affairs. This was originally just an amendment proposal. On April 10, 1979, U.S. President Carter signed this law in spite of the relevant agreement reached between China and the United States. After the Chinese made huge sacrifices, they finally got a piece of the U.S.-Taiwan Relations Act that has been interfering in China's internal affairs for a long time. The lesson is extremely painful and the legacy has far-reaching influence. Looking back, from 1979 to 2019, during the 40 years of the United States, although the United States signed the Sino-US Joint Communique on the establishment of diplomatic relations and dated the 17th Joint Communique and other communiques, however, the United States has never kept its promise to China. 5. China and Vietnam are hostile, and the Americans profit from it. U.S. President Trump will visit Hanoi, the capital of Vietnam, at the end of February 2019. The second meeting between Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un will also be held in the Vietnamese capital. As the U.S. returns to Asia and disrupts the situation in the South China Sea, Vietnam has become the grip and pawn of the U.S. The U.S. aircraft carrier has also officially returned to Cam Ranh Bay, Vietnam. The United States is using the Sino-Vietnamese border war in 1979 to make a fuss. This is a question worthy of reflection by China and Vietnam, as well as by Russia. Welcome to pay attention to the WeChat public account, Xiao Ei sees the world. Because now there is a big triangle relationship between the United States and Russia and China. Because Russia, China, and Vietnam have the same values and grand strategic interests. China and Russia have joined forces to counter the United States, and Russia's little brother, Vietnam, cannot really stand on the side of the United States. Vietnam is far away from the United States, Vietnam is very close to China and Russia, and the United States is far away from the Pacific Ocean. Now that there is no money, it is futile to want to kill people with a knife and provoke the socialist camp to disintegrate. China and Vietnam are neighbors with mountains and rivers. The friendship between China and Vietnam conforms to the interests of the two peoples, the interests of the Red Camp, and the interests of the people of Asia and the world.